In December of 2015, a wildlife camera bolted to a Lenga beach on the Patagonian steppe transmitted a photograph that stopped Cristian Saucedo in his tracks. Saucedo, the veterinarian and wildlife director for what would become Rewilding Chile, had been monitoring pumas in the Chacabuco Valley for nearly a decade. He knew pumas. He knew how they fed, how they moved, how they kept to themselves. Every field guide on record said the same thing. Pumas are solitary predators. They avoid each other, except to breed. The photograph showed 8 of them. 8 pumas, feeding from the same guanaco carcass at the same time in the open steppe. Not fighting, not threatening each other, simply eating together. No researcher had recorded that behaviour anywhere before. Not in South America, not anywhere on the continent. Saucedo later said that in 2005, when the project began, he never imagined he would see anything like it. He said the results were highly unsuspected. What changed between 2005 and 2015 was not some advanced wildlife management program or expensive engineering intervention. What changed was that someone removed 25,000 sheep and cattle from a ranch that had been running for nearly 100 years, and then they waited. This is the story of how the Chacabuco Valley, one of the most overgrazed ranching properties in South America, was given back to the species that built it, and how the land responded with a speed and completeness that no ecologist had predicted. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. The Chacabuco Valley cuts east to west through the Andes in Chile's Aysén region, roughly 300 kilometers south of the city of Coyhaique. It sits at the convergence of 2 of the most biologically distinct ecosystems on the continent. To the west are the dense southern beech forests of Chilean Patagonia. To the east is the vast arid steppe of Argentine Patagonia. The valley itself is a transition zone, a corridor and a seam where the 2 worlds meet. That seam made it singular. For at least 9,000 years, the indigenous Ionequenque people travelled through this valley following their prey. Archaeologists have documented their presence in cave paintings near the valley floor, with more than 200 red ochre motifs preserved on canyon walls. They painted hunting scenes and the animals they chased. Guanacos appeared on those walls not as curiosities, but as daily life. The guanaco is a wild camelid, the largest land mammal in Chile. Its teeth cut vegetation without tearing it, allowing plants to regrow behind them. It spreads seeds in its dung, fertilizes the soil as it walks, and provides food for pumas. Those pumas keep herds moving, which prevents overgrazing in any one area. The guanaco is not just an animal in the ecosystem, it is the mechanism that makes the ecosystem run. Before European ranching arrived in Patagonia, guanaco populations across South America numbered around 20 million. Before the estancia, before the fences, the Chacabuco Valley was dense with them. Then came the ranchers. In 1908, a British explorer named Lucas Bridges established Estancia Valle Chacabuco as a livestock operation. He cleared land, he strung wire, he introduced sheep and cattle that had no ecological relationship with the steppe they now grazed. Over the following decades, the operation grew. At its peak, nearly 25,000 animals grazed the valley at once. The steppe was not built for that. The native coiron grass grows slowly in low rainfall. The soil beneath it is thin. You can overgraze it in a single season. You can kill it in a decade. By the time the 1990s arrived, the valley had been grazed relentlessly for nearly 90 years. The grasslands were patchy and depleted. Invasive plants had moved into bare ground. Guanaco populations had been driven down to a few hundred animals. Darwin's rhea, a flightless bird that shares the steppe ecology with the guanaco, had been reduced to roughly 20 individuals. The huemul deer, a shy forest-dwelling animal that appears on Chile's national coat of arms, had retreated into isolated forest pockets where it barely survived. The valley was not a moonscape. It was something more troubling than that. It looked like a place that had been slowly drained of everything that made it alive. In 1995, a couple visited the Chacabuco Valley for the first time. Their names were Douglas and Christine Tompkins. Douglas Tompkins had founded the North Face outdoor equipment company in the 1960s, then co-founded the clothing brand Esprit. He walked away from the business world in 1990. He had been coming to Patagonia since 1968, when he drove from California to the southern tip of South America with a group of friends that included a young climber named Yvon Chouinard. He had fallen in love with the landscape then. He spent the rest of his life trying to protect it. Christine Tompkins had been chief executive officer of the outdoor clothing company Patagonia Incorporated for 20 years before she retired in 1993. She later described her corporate role as being part of the problem, selling products through an economy that was consuming the natural world. She married Doug in 1994 and moved to Chile to try something different. When they stood in the Chacabuco Valley in 1995, they saw what the land had become. They also saw what it might become again. Not everyone in Chile saw it the same way. When Doug and Chris began buying land in Patagonia on a large scale in the early 1990s, the suspicion was immediate and intense. The Chilean military monitored their movements, their phones were tapped. Conspiracy theories circulated that they were foreign intelligence agents trying to divide Chile in half. In a country that had just emerged from a military dictatorship and had nearly gone to war with Argentina over its own borders, an American buying hundreds of thousands of acres was not easy to accept. Their plan to do nothing with the land in terms of logging or agriculture made the suspicion worse. The Tompkinses pushed ahead anyway. In 2004, through their non-profit Conservación Patagónica, they purchased the 178,000-acre Estancia Valle Chacabuco for approximately $10 million. The plan was specific: remove the livestock, take down the fences, restore the grassland, build public infrastructure, and eventually donate the entire property to the Chilean state as a national park. Nobody in Chile had ever done anything like it. The work began almost immediately. The first task was the livestock. In 2004, the estancia was still running as a ranch. The transition took 4 years. The cattle and sheep were gradually sold off, and by 2008, the last of them were gone. 25,000 animals removed, every one of them. Then came the fences. The valley was laced with approximately 400 kilometres of wire fencing, nearly 250 miles of it, strung in every direction to contain livestock and exclude wildlife. Each fence was a barrier. Guanacos would not cross them. Pumas followed the guanacos. The entire movement of wildlife through the valley had been severed. To dismantle that network, Conservación Patagónica launched a volunteer program that eventually brought in 750 people from Chile and around the world. They worked with hand tools in Patagonian weather, pulling posts from the steppe, rolling wire, removing structure from the land, one section at a time. Along with the fencing, volunteers removed more than 12,000 invasive pine trees from the forests, where the huemul was struggling to survive. They pulled hemlock and rosehip from the degraded grassland zones. They spread seed of native coiron grass across the most eroded pastures. Simultaneously, the team began monitoring. Christian Saucedo and his colleagues set up camera traps across the valley. They tracked huemul deer with radio collars. They conducted annual population censuses of guanacos each summer in partnership with CONAF, Chile's National Forest Corporation. They established baseline data so that whatever happened next could be measured with precision. Former gauchos, the ranch workers whose livelihoods the estancia had sustained, were offered jobs on site. Some stayed. Over the following years, those same men who had worked cattle across the steppe began learning to track pumas and monitor nesting rheas. Their knowledge of the land, built up over decades of ranching, turned out to be one of the most valuable tools in the restoration. In the first years, progress was slow and uncertain. The grasslands showed only modest signs of recovery. The guanaco numbers were still low. Most ecologists estimated that meaningful ecological recovery in a severely overgrazed steppe would take, at minimum, several decades. That estimate turned out to be wrong. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation about Patagonian rewilding. By around 2012, 4 years after the last cattle left, Christian Saucedo and his team began noticing things that did not fit their models. Guanacos were appearing in parts of the valley that had been completely empty for generations, not small groups, herds. They were moving freely through areas where the fences had stood. Saucedo later described results that were highly unexpected. Results he never thought he would see when the project began in 2005. Let me put that in context. When Conservación Patagónica purchased the estancia in 2004, guanaco numbers across the valley were estimated at a few hundred animals. By the time formal monitoring data was compiled, surveys showed more than 3,000 guanacos living in the Chacabuco Valley and surrounding reserves. A population increase from a few hundred to more than 3,000 in roughly 15 years without any active reintroduction program. The guanacos simply moved back in through the open corridors where the fences had stood. And where the guanacos went, everything else followed. The pumas, which had been driven into remote mountain terrain by a century of ranching persecution, followed the guanaco herds back onto the valley floor. Puma monitoring data that Saucedo's team had been gathering since 2008 began showing something that forced researchers to reconsider what they thought they knew. Pumas were not just returning to the valley, they were being observed in groups. The camera trap image from 2015 showing 8 pumas feeding from a single guanaco carcass simultaneously became one of the most discussed pieces of documentation to come out of the project. Pumas had been classified as solitary predators for as long as anyone had been studying them. Saucedo said that the group behaviour observed over those 15 years of restoration made researchers rethink questions that had seemed settled. Here is the key insight that changed everything. Dense guanaco populations produce kills large enough to feed multiple animals at once. When the threat of persecution by ranchers disappears, pumas lose their wariness of open ground. They move out of the mountains and back into the valley. And when they stop hiding, they show us how they actually behave when they are not under pressure. After the pumas came the condors. The Andean condor has a wingspan of up to 9 feet. It is a scavenger that depends on large ungulate carcasses. With guanaco herds now numbering in the thousands, the food supply for condors expanded dramatically. Multiple Andean condors were eventually released in the park as part of active conservation programs, joining populations that had already begun returning on their own. The Darwin's Rio required more active intervention. Rewilding Chile established a breeding centre for the species, and over a decade of releases that began around 2014, more than 130 animals had been returned to the steppe. In a single release event in 2024, 23 young rheas were set free. Cristian Saucedo described that release as the final stage of a long road of work that, year after year, moved the project closer to re-establishing an important member of the Eisen fauna. He said the challenge remained large, and they would continue until the rhea was running freely among Coiron again. The grassland itself confounded the models most directly. Scientists expected slow recovery over many decades. What the restoration team observed was described as an amazing and faster than expected recovery. The Coiron was regrowing, the erosion was slowing, the soil was beginning to rebuild. The system was rebuilding itself, not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly then suddenly, a single guanaco costs nothing to restore if you simply open the corridor it needs to walk through. It grazes without destroying, it spreads seed, it draws the predators that keep herds moving. The 3,000 guanacos now living in Patagonia National Park provide food for the condors and pumas above them and rebuild the soil biology below. The cost of engineering the same seed dispersal, soil fertilization, and grazing regulation they provide naturally would be incalculable. This is not romantic nature worship. This is hard-nosed economics. But this is not a simple story, and it would not be honest to tell it as one. When Doug and Chris Tompkins arrived in the Chacabuco Valley, they were not arriving in an empty landscape. They were arriving in a place where families had lived for generations. The gauchos who worked the estancia had built their lives around that land. They knew every ridge and river bend. They had raised children in those valleys. The announcement that the ranch was ending, that the cattle were going, that an American couple with conservation intentions was taking over, was not experienced by everyone as good news. Some ranching families in the surrounding region feared what a national park would mean for their way of life. Restrictions on access, rules about what you could do near your own land, a way of life that had already been economically precarious, now made uncertain by decisions being made by people from another country. Dago Guzman, a Chilean researcher who had started out skeptical of the Tompkins project before eventually working with it for 16 years, described arriving in the region to find that people were asking questions about a mysterious project that was going to take possession of the lands and waters of Chile. He said those suspicions were not irrational. They were the product of a place that had experienced dictatorship and foreign interference and had learned to be cautious. The community near Cochrane, the closest town to the park, was navigating a transition from a ranching economy to a tourism economy. That transition created new jobs. It also ended old ones. A family whose identity and livelihood had been tied to ranching for 3 generations does not automatically become a wildlife ranger because a national park opened nearby. A conservation strategy fund analysis found that protected areas in Chilean Patagonia were significantly correlated with reductions in poverty in surrounding communities. That data is real, but correlation is not a guarantee. The transition asked a lot of people who had not chosen to be part of someone else's conservation vision. Chris Tompkins has acknowledged that they could have done some things differently. That degree of controversy, she said, was unavoidable when something new and unfamiliar arrives and people cannot yet understand it. What is undeniable is that the gauchos who stayed were retrained as park rangers. That more than 50 students received scholarships through programs the park created. That the outdoor education program connecting local children to the valley's ecology was eventually highlighted by Chile's Ministry of Education as a model for best practices. That the annual Huemul hike the park sponsored grew into a tourist attraction run by the Cochrane municipality itself. Those outcomes matter. They do not erase the friction. They exist alongside it. In December of 2015, while the restoration of the Chacabuco Valley was still underway and the models were still being broken, Douglas Tompkins died. His kayak capsized on General Carrera Lake in a storm. He succumbed to hypothermia. He was 72 years old. At the time of his death, the park had been assembled and the rewilding was producing results that no one had fully predicted. But the formal transfer to the Chilean state had not yet occurred. Chris Tompkins carried that work through grief and through the complexity of an 8-part legal agreement governing everything from land use to wildlife conservation. On January 29, 2018, Chilean President Michelle Bachelet and Chris Tompkins signed a decree creating 5 new national parks in Chile. One of them was Patagonia National Park. The 178,000-acre Chacabuco Valley was donated to the Chilean state. Combined with the adjacent reserves of Ginimeni and Cochrane, the new park covered roughly 640,000 acres. It was the largest private land donation in Chile's history. Stand in the Chacabuco Valley today, and you will see what it looks like when a nearly destroyed ecosystem is returned to the species that shaped it. The golden steppe grass rolls out across the valley floor. Turquoise rivers cut through it, clear and cold, fed by Andean glaciers. A herd of guanacos stands on a far ridge, calm and unhurried, the way they looked on the cave paintings 9,000 years ago. An Andean condor circles overhead, 9 feet of wingspan against the southern sky, riding a thermal above the Quairon. Somewhere in the Lenga forest, a Huemul deer moves through the trees. Only 1,500 of them remain on the planet. Patagonia National Park holds one of the largest surviving populations. And somewhere in that valley, a puma that was never supposed to hunt in a group is standing beside 7 others, eating. The valley that was stripped nearly bare by a century of overstocking is now one of the most important conservation areas in South America. It did not take centuries to recover. It took less than 20 years. The models predicted it would take much longer. The data refused to fit the models. This is happening across Chilean Patagonia, and most people have never heard the full story of how it started. It started with a fence, and with the decision to take it down. What surprised you most about this story? Was it the pumas? Was it the speed? Was it what a single fence line can prevent when it is finally removed? Leave your answer below. If you are not subscribed yet, now's the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next ones.